He stood at the end of the driveway and told himself he was ready. He had been telling himself that for the last 40 miles of the drive. He had been telling himself that since the morning he packed a single bag and pointed the car north toward Ohio and felt his hands tighten on the wheel in a way that had nothing to do with the traffic. He had rehearsed this in his mind 10,000 times during 13 years of recovery in a hospital room in Louisiana. He had imagined the driveway, the path, the porch, the blue door he had painted himself on a Saturday afternoon because the woman he loved said blue gave a house a personality. He had imagined knocking. He had imagined the door opening. He had imagined Claire standing there. He had imagined what he would say and what she might say and how it might feel to finally, after everything, be standing in front of her again. He had imagined all of it. He had imagined it so many times and in so many variations that he was certain, standing at the end of that driveway on a Tuesday afternoon in October, that there was nothing that door could show him that he had not already prepared himself for. He was wrong. He walked up the path. He raised his hand. He knocked. He heard movement inside. He heard voices, small voices, more than one. Children's voices. His brow pulled together slightly. He heard footsteps crossing toward him. The latch turned. The door swung open. And Claire stood in the doorway looking at him like she had seen something that could not exist. And pressed against her, one on each side and one slightly behind, were 3 children he had never seen in his life. None of them knew his name. None of them knew his face. None of them knew what the look on this stranger's face meant or why the color had drained out of their mothers completely. Marcus Reed stood on the porch of the house he built with his own 2 hands and looked at 3 children he did not know and felt the world reorganize itself into a shape he had not imagined. Not once. Not in 10,000 rehearsals. Not even close. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from right now. We would genuinely love to hear from you. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single one of our upcoming stories. Because to understand the full weight of what happened on that porch, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. And the beginning of this story starts not with Marcus, but with the mother who raised him, the woman who spent 13 years sitting on the edge of a bed in a dark room and refusing, with everything she had, to close the door. Margaret Reed had lived in the same house on the same quiet street in Columbus, Ohio for over 30 years by the time any of this happened. It was the kind of house that had absorbed the whole shape of a family's life into its walls. The kitchen table had been the site of every important conversation the Reed family had ever had. Arguments settled there. News delivered there. Grief carried there. Coffee drunk there at every hour of the day and night depending on what the occasion required. Gerald Reed, her husband of 38 years, was the kind of man who did not say a great deal but meant everything he said, a methodical and patient man shaped by decades of manufacturing work and by the specific discipline of raising 2 sons in a world that required them to know how to show up. Their older son, Daniel, had moved to Phoenix after college and called every Sunday without exception, reliable and warm and steady in the way that firstborn children sometimes are when they have watched their parents closely enough to understand what consistency actually costs. Their younger son, Marcus, was different. Not better. Not worse. But different in a way that Margaret had understood from the time he was old enough to notice things other children walked past without seeing. Marcus was the kind of person who fixed what was broken before anyone asked. He showed up on Saturday mornings without calling ahead and spent entire days doing things around the house that needed doing. He changed gutters and repoured cracked concrete and refinished floors and sat at that kitchen table for hours with Margaret's 2 strong coffee and talked about everything in the unhurried way of someone who is completely comfortable exactly where he is. He was, in the simplest and most complete sense of the word, home to her. Not the house. Him. He was home. And when he married Claire at 26 years old and Margaret stood in the back of the church watching her son look at his wife during their vows with the expression of a man who has found the one thing he intended to spend the rest of his life taking care of, she cried not from sadness but from the overwhelming fullness of a moment too large to hold without leaking. Claire was exactly the kind of woman Margaret had hoped her son would find, not because she was easy or simple, but because she was honest and strong and completely without pretense. She said what she meant. She fixed things herself when they broke. She looked at Marcus the way a person looks at something they have decided to protect, and Margaret, who had been watching people her whole life, recognized that look and trusted it immediately. Gerald liked her for the simplest possible reason. She did not perform anything. She was exactly herself in every room, and that quality, he told Margaret one evening, was rarer than most people understood. Marcus and Claire moved into a house 20 minutes away, on a street lined with old oak trees, and Marcus did what he always did in any space that needed attention: he worked on it until it was right. The back fence rebuilt. The attic re-insulated. The porch step fixed. And the front door, painted colonial blue on a Saturday afternoon because Claire had said, laughing, that blue gave a house a personality, and Marcus had gone to the hardware store and come home with 2 gallons and spent the whole afternoon on his knees making her right. 2 years into their marriage, Claire got pregnant. And that same month, the call came from the oil company. They needed contract workers for an offshore rig in the Gulf of Mexico. 4 months of work. The pay was more than Marcus made in a full year. The baby was coming. The roof needed replacing. The savings were thin. After 3 evenings of careful conversation at their kitchen table, Marcus said yes. He came to his parents' house the night before he left. He sat in his chair at the kitchen table and drank his mother's coffee and told them about the job the way he always told them things, directly and without drama. Margaret asked the questions she always asked. Gerald asked about the company's safety protocols and nodded when Marcus answered. When the evening ended and Marcus stood to go, Margaret walked him to the car in the driveway the way she had done since he was 17 years old. The night was cool. The neighbor's garden smelled faintly sweet in the dark. She stood in the driveway and took his face in both her hands the way she had done 1,000 times, and she looked at him. Memorizing him, though she did not know that was what she was doing. "Call us every week," she said. "Not when you feel like it. Every week without fail." He promised her. He kissed her cheek and got in his truck. She stood in the driveway and watched the taillights disappear around the corner. Then she went back inside and washed the coffee cups and turned off the kitchen light. She did not know, standing at that sink, that those taillights were the last she would see of her son for 13 years. She did not know that the hands she had just held his face in would not touch him again for longer than some people's entire childhoods. She just washed the cups and turned off the light and went to bed, the way you do at the end of an ordinary evening, because nothing about that evening had given her any reason to know it was anything other than that. 6 weeks later, at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, the phone rang in their kitchen. Gerald answered. He listened for 4 minutes without saying much. When he hung up, he walked to the doorway of the living room where Margaret was already on her feet, because something in the hour and the silence of his end of the call had pulled her upright before he even put the phone down. He stood in the doorway and said the 3 words that would divide her life permanently into a before and an after: "Marcus is missing." She sat back down. She was quiet for a long moment. The room was very still. The clock on the mantel kept going. Outside, a car passed on the street. Then Margaret said, with a steadiness that came not from calm but from something deeper than calm, something closer to refusal, "Missing is not dead." She said it like a decision. Like a line drawn in the ground that she was not going to allow anyone to move her past. Then she stood up and put on her coat because Claire was 7 months pregnant and 20 minutes away and someone needed to get there right now. Gerald drove. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with her hands flat on her knees and her eyes on the road ahead and did not speak for the whole 20 minutes. When they arrived, Gerald went inside to tell Claire while Margaret stood on the porch for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the blue door, breathing the cold night air, holding herself together from the inside. She could hear Gerald's voice through the door, low and steady, delivering the facts the way he always delivered hard things. Then silence. Then Claire's voice, and something in the sound of it that Margaret would carry in her chest for years. She pressed her hand against that door one more moment. Then she opened it and went inside, because that was what you did. You went inside. You sat at the table. You held the people who needed holding, even when you were the one who needed it most. The search lasted 3 weeks and produced almost nothing. Debris from the rig. One life jacket. No bodies. No survivors found for any of the 4 missing men. The Coast Guard stood down. The company filed its report. 31 days after Marcus went into the Gulf of Mexico on a Tuesday night in a storm, a formal letter arrived declaring him missing at sea and presumed dead. Gerald opened it at the kitchen table. He read it. He folded it carefully. He set it on the counter. Then he went outside and sat on the front porch for a long time without moving. Margaret found him there an hour later. She sat beside him. They did not speak. They just sat on the porch of the house where they had raised their sons, in the neighborhood Marcus had grown up in, and they let the weight of it settle between them like something that had always been coming and had finally arrived. Then Margaret stood up. She went inside. She walked down the hall and opened the door to Marcus's old bedroom and stood in the doorway looking at the room they had kept exactly as it was. The baseball cap on the hook behind the door. The high school track trophy on the shelf. The smell of old wood and something she had never been able to name exactly, but that was simply, specifically, him. She walked to the bed and sat on the edge of it. She sat there for a long time in the quiet. Then she got up. She pulled the door mostly closed but not all the way. She went back to the kitchen and made coffee. She sat at the table. And she started a list of every phone number, every company contact, every official she could call in the morning to push for more information, more certainty, more something, because the word presumed was not a period. It was a comma. And Margaret Reed was not finished with the sentence. In the weeks that followed, the Reed household ran on the fuel of movement and necessity. There were calls to make and arrangements to manage, and a daughter-in-law who was 8 months pregnant and alone in a house 20 minutes away who needed more than condolences. Margaret and Gerald drove to Claire's house every weekend without being asked. They brought food. Gerald fixed the back porch step that had been loose since before Marcus left. He did not mention it. He simply noticed it one Saturday, got his tools from the truck, fixed it in 15 minutes, put his tools away, and went inside for coffee. Margaret noticed and said nothing to him about it. That evening, sitting at the table, she reached under it and found his hand and held it briefly. He squeezed back without looking at her. They both understood what the step meant. It was not just a step. It was what you did when the person who would have fixed it himself was not there to fix it. You fixed it in their name. You kept the thing going that they would have kept going. That was the only form of loyalty available now, and Gerald Reed was going to practice it without complaint for as long as it took. The baby came a month after the official notification arrived. A girl, healthy and small, born with her father's hands, those long, capable fingers that Margaret noticed the moment the nurse placed her in her arms. Claire named her Rose. Margaret sat beside Claire's hospital bed and held her granddaughter and felt something that was simultaneously the purest joy and the most specific grief she had ever experienced at the same time, because Rose had Marcus's hands and Marcus was not there to see them. She did not say this out loud. She held the baby and looked at those hands and said, "She has all of him that we need right now," and she meant it in the complicated, layered way that mothers mean things when they are holding 2 enormous truths at once and refusing to let either one crush the other. The first year moved the way survival moves, forward, because stopping was not an option. Margaret and Gerald were at Claire's house every weekend. They learned Rose's schedule and her particular preferences and the specific sound she made when she was hungry versus tired versus simply done with being held by anyone who was not her mother. They loved her with the absolute completeness of grandparents who understand that this child is one of the last unbroken lines running between themselves and the person they are not ready to release. Gerald came every week and found something to fix, because Claire's house was a house that Marcus had been maintaining and his absence meant things had begun to fall behind. A loose shutter. A dripping tap. A light fitting that flickered. He worked through these things one by one on his Saturday visits the way a man works through a list that keeps being added to, steadily and without complaint, because some lists are never truly finished and the working matters more than the completion. Margaret watched him do this and loved him for it in a way that had no adequate expression other than the coffee she kept hot for him and the way she walked him to the car at the end of every visit, the way Marcus had always been walked to the car. In the second year, something shifted in Claire. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But Margaret noticed it over the course of several Sunday visits, a gradual reorganization in the way she carried herself, something lighter and more forward-facing. The grief was still there. Margaret could see it. But it had moved from the front of Claire to the middle of her, incorporated rather than displayed. She mentioned it to Gerald one evening after they had driven home. "She is finding her footing," she said. Gerald said, "Good. That is what he would want." And Margaret sat with that for a long time because she knew it was true and because truth does not always arrive without cost. In the third year, Claire went back to work at a pediatric clinic, built a routine, found her stride. In the fourth year, she told Margaret about a man she had met. His name was David Park. A physical therapist. Quiet and steady, raising a son named Eli on his own after a painful divorce. She was not looking for anything. Neither was he. It had simply happened the way quiet things happen between people who are not performing anything, slowly and without announcement. Margaret sat at the kitchen table and held her coffee cup with both hands and listened to Claire tell her everything carefully and honestly, the way Claire always did things, and when she was done, Margaret asked two questions. "Is he a good man? Is he kind to Rose?" Claire answered yes to both immediately, without hesitation, and Margaret could hear in the directness of it that she was telling the whole truth and not a managed version of it. Margaret looked at the table for a long moment. This was one of the hardest things she had been asked to receive in 4 years of hard things. Not because Claire had done anything wrong. She had done nothing wrong. She had been faithful and patient and she had kept Rose connected to the Reed family and she had grieved Marcus with a fullness and a dignity that Margaret respected deeply. But accepting this meant releasing the last thread of maybe. The thin, persistent, quietly held possibility that Margaret had been keeping in the closed but not locked bedroom at the end of the hall. She looked up at Claire and said, "I will not stand in the way of your happiness. My son would never forgive me if I did." Claire reached across the table and held Margaret's hand for a moment. Neither of them said anything else. There was nothing else to say that the silence did not already hold completely. Claire and David married in the 5th year. Margaret did not attend. She told Claire she was unwell and Claire understood and did not press her, because Claire had always understood the difference between what was said and what was true, and she loved Margaret enough to give her that privacy. Gerald went alone, in the quiet and composed way Gerald did difficult things. He sat near the back and kept his face still and held Rose on his lap when she fell asleep during the reception, her small head tucked against his arm with the complete trust of a child who knows she is safe. He sat in that chair at the edge of the room holding his sleeping granddaughter and watched the woman his son had married dance with another man, and he kept everything he was feeling on the inside where it belonged. Before he left, he found Claire and held her by both shoulders and looked her in the eyes and said, "Be happy. That is the only thing I will ever ask of you again. Just be happy." He drove home through the dark and walked through the front door and found Margaret at the kitchen table with the lights low and her coffee cold. He sat across from her. He told her everything about the evening in careful, complete detail. When he was done, she nodded slowly. She got up. She walked down the hall. She opened Marcus's door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and stayed there for a long time with the baseball cap and the track trophy and the unnamed smell of a room that had not changed. Gerald made tea and left a cup on the kitchen table and waited. This was the ritual. This was how they carried it. No shortcuts. No pretending. Just the full weight of it, held together, 1 year at a time. In year 6, Claire and David had a son named Sam. In year 8, they adopted a little girl from the foster system named Maya, 3 years old, fierce and full of personality, who within 6 months of arriving had established herself as the emotional center of the household's daily chaos. Rose was now 9, serious and quiet and drawing constantly, always with a pencil within reach. Eli, David's son, was the kind of older brother who took his position seriously and complained about it equally. The house with the blue door was full of the particular, irreplaceable noise of a family that had built itself through love and decision rather than just biology. Margaret and Gerald came to birthdays and school events. They brought food. Gerald fixed things. They loved Rose with everything they had, and they extended that love carefully, genuinely, to Sam and Maya and Eli, not because the situation required it but because these children were Rose's family, and Rose was their granddaughter, and that connection did not have a boundary they were willing to stop at. But every year, on the anniversary of the accident, Margaret went down the hall and sat on the edge of Marcus's bed. She sat with the baseball cap and the trophy and the unnamed smell, and she let herself feel the full and unmanaged weight of his absence, privately and completely. And then she got up and closed the door and went back to the rest of her life. Because that was how she carried it. That was always how she carried it. One day a year where she did not have to be strong for anyone. And 364 days where she was. What nobody in Columbus knew, while all of this was happening across 13 years of absence and grief and birthday cakes and fixed porch steps and a bedroom kept unchanged at the end of a hall, was that Marcus Reed was alive. He had been alive the entire time. He had survived the Gulf of Mexico on a Tuesday night because a small fishing vessel, running late back to port after the storm, had found him in the water barely conscious and pulled him out. He had a traumatic brain injury from the impact of hitting the water in the dark. 2 broken ribs. No identification on him, everything lost in the water. By the time the fishing vessel reached the Louisiana coastline, Marcus was unconscious in a way the doctors at the small regional hospital were not certain he would recover from. He was admitted as a John Doe. He was transferred twice between facilities. He was given a name for administrative purposes because a hospital cannot keep a patient indefinitely under a blank, and that name, assigned from a clerical error in the chaos of a busy intake system, was not his. He survived. He woke up weeks later in a room in southern Louisiana with no identification, no phone, no wallet, no way to prove who he was, and a mind that had been rearranged by trauma in ways that made the simplest act of self-identification feel like trying to read a page with half the letters missing. He knew things. He knew how to speak. He knew how to walk. He knew, in a floating and unanchored way, that somewhere there was a woman he loved and a house with a blue door and a kitchen that smelled of coffee that was always too strong. But the specific details that would have allowed anyone to find him, names, towns, phone numbers, a street, a company, a last name, these came and went in fragments that could not be held still long enough to use. The doctors explained it carefully. The brain, after severe trauma, does not recover on a timetable. It recovers the way it recovers, non-linearly, in pieces, with setbacks and plateaus and unexpected windows of clarity followed by long stretches of fog. They told him to be patient. He had no choice but to be patient. The months turned. The years turned. And Marcus Reed lay in a facility in Louisiana and tried, every single day, to remember the name of the woman with the face he could not let go of. In year 9, he remembered the smell of a specific kitchen. In year 10, he remembered a name. Margaret. He woke up one morning and said it out loud into the empty room because it had arrived in his mind with such sudden, absolute certainty that he needed to hear it in the air to confirm it was real. Margaret. His mother's name. He told his care coordinator. She noted it. He described a kitchen table. 2 strong coffee. A driveway. A Saturday morning with a canvas bag full of tools. The sound of a truck engine in the cold. The feel of someone's hands on his face at a moment he could not fully place. They searched. Without a last name and without a town, the search was slow and produced no certain matches. In year 11, he remembered his own first name. Marcus. In year 12, he remembered Gerald. By the beginning of year 13, a social worker named Andrea Thompson, who had made his case a personal priority and who believed without apology that every unidentified person in the system was someone's missing piece, had enough detail to narrow the search significantly. A man named Marcus. A mother named Margaret. A father named Gerald. A town in Ohio. An oil rig accident in the Gulf. It took 4 more months of careful cross-referencing. And then, on a Thursday morning in October, 13 years and 1 month after the accident, Andrea Thompson made a phone call to a house in Columbus, Ohio where a woman was standing at the kitchen counter writing a grocery list, and everything changed. The phone rang at 9:17 in the morning. Margaret answered it. The voice on the other end identified itself calmly and asked, with the careful precision of someone trained to deliver seismic things without causing additional damage, "Am I speaking with Margaret Reed, mother of a man named Marcus Reed?" The grocery list dropped from her hand. She did not notice it fall. She gripped the phone with both hands and said, in a voice that was suddenly very small and very still, "Yes. Yes, I am his mother." Gerald was on his feet before she finished the sentence. He had been at the table 3 feet away and he had heard something in the way she said yes that brought him across the kitchen without a single conscious thought. He put both hands on her shoulders and stood there while she listened to a woman in Louisiana explain, carefully and completely, that her son was alive. That he had been in a care facility in Baton Rouge for 13 years. That he had been admitted as an unidentified patient following a rescue at sea on the night of the accident. That documentation errors and the severity of his brain injury had made it impossible to identify him for years. That he had been recovering slowly and non-linearly for over a decade. And that in recent months, as his cognition had improved significantly, he had been able to provide enough specific detail for investigators to find his family. He was alive. He was in Louisiana. He was asking for his parents. Margaret stood at the kitchen wall and listened to all of this and did not make a sound until the social worker finished speaking. Then she said, in a voice that was absolutely clear and completely composed, "Tell me the exact address. I need to write it down right now." She picked the grocery list up off the floor. She turned it over. She wrote on the back of it. Gerald read the address upside down over her shoulder and went to find his keys before she had even put the phone down. They drove. Gerald said he needed his hands on the wheel and Margaret understood this without discussion. They left within the hour, heading south through Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee and into the heavy green air of Louisiana, the landscape shifting around them over 12 hours while neither of them slept and neither of them talked very much. The important things had already been said. Everything else was just the distance between where they were and where their son was, and they were eating through it mile by mile with Gerald's hands on the wheel and Margaret's hands in her lap and the address written on the back of a grocery list in the cup holder between them. "About 2 hours from Baton Rouge," Margaret said. "What if he doesn't know us right away? What if we walk in and the name is there but the feeling is still somewhere he can't reach?" Gerald drove for a moment. Then he said, "The feeling is there. I know it is. And even if it takes time, we know who he is. We have known who he is since the day he was born. We can remind him. We have done it before and we can do it again." She nodded and turned back to the window. They drove the last 2 hours in the particular silence of people who have been together long enough that silence is not absence but presence, and who are, for the first time in 13 years, driving towards something rather than sitting still inside something that will not move. If you are still watching at this exact moment, stop what you are doing and drop a comment right now with the words, "I'm still here." Because what happens next, the moment in that hospital room and everything that follows it, is the part of this story that this whole 13 years has been building toward. The facility was a low building set back behind old oak trees. Gerald parked. They walked in. A staff member led them down a corridor to a room at the end of a hall. She said Marcus had been awake since before 5 that morning. She said he was having a good day. She opened the door and stepped aside. Margaret walked in first. The room was simple. A bed. A chair by the window. A small shelf. Afternoon light coming through the glass in a pale stripe across the floor. Marcus was sitting in the chair looking at his hands when the door opened. He looked up. He looked at his mother. And everything in his face that had been held in careful, managed stillness for years simply released all at once, the way a held breath releases, the way a fist opens. Margaret crossed the room and put both hands on either side of her son's face the way she had done 10,000 times across his whole life, and she looked at him. She did not speak for a long moment. She just looked at all of it, the lines, the gray in his hair, the evidence of everything that had been done to him by time and distance and a world that had misplaced him. She held his face and she took inventory and she said, in the quietest and most complete voice she had ever used, "There you are." Gerald had stopped in the doorway because his legs had reached their limit. He held the doorframe with one hand and breathed slowly and deliberately, in through the nose and out through the mouth, the way you breathe when something is trying to undo you from the inside. Then Marcus looked over his mother's shoulder and found his father. Gerald walked across the room. He put both arms around his son. Marcus put both arms around his father. Margaret wrapped her arms around both of them. The three of them stood in that room in Louisiana and held each other without a single word, and 13 years of everything collapsed into a silence so full that there was no room in it for anything else. They stayed 4 days. They sat with Marcus for hours each day, learning the contours of who he was now, what had returned, what was still in the process of returning, what had been permanently rearranged by injury and time and had been replaced by something new. His humor was there, dry and quiet and arriving without warning. His patience was there. His instinct for reading what people around him needed before they said it. His particular way of sitting with difficult things without flinching. These had survived everything. On the second evening, after Margaret had gone to walk the grounds with Andrea Thompson, Gerald sat alone with his son and told him what he needed to know about Claire. He told him directly and without softening. He said there was a man named David. That they had married. That there were children. He did not give specific numbers. He did not give names yet. He told Marcus what was essential: the woman he had left behind had done exactly what any person who was still alive and still had to live had to do. She had kept going. Gerald watched his son's face while he spoke. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Marcus looked at the window. Then he said, "Is Rose okay? Is she happy?" Gerald said yes. Marcus nodded slowly. Then that's what matters most. Gerald gripped his son's shoulder once, briefly, and stood up to find them something to eat because there was always something practical to be done, and a man who cannot find something practical to do when emotion is this large will come apart, and Gerald Reed had not come this far to come apart now. Marcus spent 4 months in recovery before the doctors cleared him for extended travel. He worked with a counselor. He processed. He thought about Rose every single day. He thought about what returning to that house actually meant now, not what it had meant in the abstract during years of imagining it, but what it meant in the specific and present reality of what Gerald had told him. A man named David lived in that house. Children he did not know lived in that house. The house was not his to walk back into as if time had simply paused. He understood this. He had spent 13 years in a place that required him to understand things he would not have chosen to understand. What he wanted from the return was not what he had wanted at 26. At 26 he had wanted his life back, whole and unchanged. What he wanted now was simpler and in some ways more difficult. He wanted to see Claire. He needed to stand in front of her and tell her, with his body in the same room as hers, that he understood. Not to reclaim anything. Not to ask for anything. Just to make sure she knew that the man who had loved her and built that house and painted that door and made that promise on the porch understood completely and without reservation what she had done and why, and that it was right. And he needed to see Rose. To stand in front of his daughter, whose face he had never seen except in the photographs his parents had brought to Louisiana, and let her see him and decide for herself who he was going to be in her life. That was what he wanted. Those two things. Everything else would follow from those, or it would not follow at all, and either way he was going to live with the outcome, because living with outcomes was something 13 years in a hospital room in Louisiana had made him exceptionally well equipped to do. He told his parents his plan on a Sunday morning phone call. He had called them every morning since the reunion in Baton Rouge, which was the one thing Margaret had asked for: "Just call me every morning so I know you are there." He had not missed a single morning. He told them he was going to drive to Columbus and knock on Claire's door. He said he needed to do this one alone. Margaret was quiet for a moment. He could hear what the quiet was. Then she said, "All right." Gerald, on the other extension, said, "You call us after." Marcus said he would. What he did not tell them, because he did not yet know it himself, was what was waiting behind that door. Because Gerald had told him about David. Gerald had told him Claire had married again. Gerald had told him, carefully and with deliberate restraint, that Claire had moved on and built a life, and that the house was now a different household than the one Marcus had left. But Gerald had not said how many children. He had said children, plural, in a careful and unspecific way, because he was leaving something for Marcus to see for himself rather than to arrive at the door having been fully briefed on everything he would find, the way a person arrives at a film already knowing every scene. Gerald was a man who understood, without ever having put it in those words, that some things need to be met in person. Some things need to be felt in real time, in the body, standing on actual ground, not absorbed in advance from a chair in a hospital room in Louisiana. He had told Marcus what was essential. He had left the rest to the door. Marcus drove to Columbus on a Tuesday. He did not plan that day of the week. It was simply when the drive worked out. He did not realize until he was pulling off the highway that it was Tuesday, the same day he had left 13 years ago. He sat with that for a moment. Then he kept driving. He moved through streets he remembered with the specific disorientation of someone returning to a place that is both deeply familiar and subtly wrong, every corner and storefront overlaid with the version he had carried in his memory for years and the version that existed now, never quite matching up. He turned onto the street. He parked at the far end of the block. He sat in the car for a moment with his hands on the wheel. The oaks were bigger. The light was the flat, low light of October. And the house he had chosen and bought and worked on and shaped into a home, stood exactly where he had left it on the quiet street, with the blue door still blue. He had not known, until this moment, how much that detail would mean to him. It had not been repainted. In 13 years, nobody had painted over the colonial blue he had put there on a Saturday afternoon because the woman he loved said blue gave a house a personality. He did not know what that meant. He did not try to decide. He got out of the car and walked up the block and turned up the path and stopped at the door. He raised his hand. He knocked. He heard a television somewhere inside. He heard a child's voice, high and clear, saying something he could not make out. Then another voice, younger, a different pitch. His hand, still raised at the door, held its position without him deciding to hold it. Then footsteps, adult footsteps, crossing toward him. The latch turned. The door opened. Claire stood in the doorway and looked at him, and the dish towel she was holding dropped from her hand and hit the floor, and she did not move to pick it up, and she did not say anything at all. She looked at him the way a person looks at something that cannot exist and yet is standing right there in the October light on the porch of the house with the blue door. Marcus looked at her. He had imagined this moment for 13 years. He had imagined her face and her eyes and the specific way she would look at him when she understood who was standing there. What he had not imagined, because he had not been given the specific information he would have needed to imagine it, was what was behind her. Pressed against her left side, one hand on Claire's arm, was a girl. Tall for her age, with long, capable hands and a pencil tucked behind her ear and a way of holding herself, arms not quite crossed, weight slightly back, that spoke of someone who has learned to observe before she commits. On Claire's right, pressed close and staring at Marcus with the completely unfiltered curiosity of a young boy who has not yet learned that staring is considered impolite, was a child of about 7 with his chin tilted up and his eyes absolutely locked on this stranger on his porch. And from behind Claire's back, one small hand gripping the hem of her sweater, the top of a dark-haired head appeared, cautiously, at hip height, and a pair of wide, serious eyes looked out at Marcus from behind the safety of his mother's body. 3 children. 3 children he had never seen. 3 children who did not know his name or his face or his history or what this moment was or why this man standing on their porch looked the way he looked, like someone who has walked a very long way to get to a door and has now arrived and is not entirely sure the arriving is survivable. Marcus stood on that porch and looked at 3 children he did not know, behind the woman he had spent 13 years finding his way back to, and felt the ground shift under him in a way that no amount of preparation could have cushioned. Because knowing that life goes on is one thing. It is a concept. It is a sentence. It can be understood from a chair in a hospital room in Louisiana. But standing on the porch and seeing it, seeing the specific, breathing, present, real evidence of it in 3 children behind a woman with a dropped dish towel and tears already moving down her face, that is something else entirely. That is not a concept. That is the full weight of 13 years landing on you at once, all at once, on a porch in October, in the body, on actual ground. The silence lasted long enough that the little girl behind Claire's back tightened her grip on the sweater fabric. The boy on Claire's right, still staring, tilted his head slightly the way children do when they are trying to solve something. And the girl on Claire's left, the one with the pencil behind her ear, looked at Marcus with eyes that were doing something more complex than staring. She was looking at him the way she looked at everything she was trying to draw, carefully and completely, taking in all the information before deciding anything about it. Claire found her voice first. It came out very quietly. Marcus. Not a question. She knew. She had known from the moment the door opened. There was no world in which she could not have known. He said, Claire. His voice was lower than she remembered, worn smooth by years, but the specific quality of it, the way it inhabited the space it was in without filling all of it, was unchanged. She stepped back from the door. She opened it wider. He stepped inside. He stepped into the entry hall of the house he had built and stood there and looked at what 13 years had filled it with. Small shoes by the door in 3 sizes. A child's drawing on the refrigerator visible through to the kitchen, pencil lines, precise and detailed. A backpack on a hook. A painting on the wall, vivid and uncontrolled, the kind that a very small child makes when handed a brush and left to it. The smell of the house underneath everything new, faintly of the wood he had refinished himself and of something baked earlier in the day and of the specific domestic warmth of a space that is truly, fully lived in. He stood in that hall and took it all in and said nothing. The boy, who was 7 years old and had not yet developed the reflex that tells you not to ask the thing you are thinking, looked up at him and said, "Do you know my mom?" Marcus looked down at this boy who had no idea who he was and felt something move through him that he did not have a clean name for. He said, "Yes. I do." The boy considered this. Then he said, "Are you hungry? We had pasta." And Marcus Reed, standing in the hallway of the house he had built with his own 2 hands 13 years ago, looked at this child who was completely unaware of the weight of the moment he was standing in the middle of, and said, "I think I could eat." Claire made coffee at the kitchen table because it was the only thing that made sense. The boy, Sam, sat across from Marcus and ate an apple and watched him with open, guileless curiosity. The little girl, Maya, had disappeared briefly and come back carrying a drawing she had made that afternoon and held it out to Marcus without a word, because she had decided, in the way that 5-year-olds make social decisions, that a drawing was an appropriate greeting for a stranger in her house. Marcus took it and held it with both hands. It was a house. Drawn in a child's bold, imprecise lines, bright colors, a door at the center, 2 windows, something green to one side that was either a tree or a bush or both. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up at Claire, who was standing at the counter watching him with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and tears drying on her face, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say yet, and she understood because she had always understood the difference between a silence that was empty and a silence that was simply not finished. And then, from the end of the table where she had been sitting quietly the entire time with her sketchbook open in front of her, the girl with the pencil behind her ear did something. She reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and took out a piece of paper, folded into quarters, that had the particular softness of something carried for a long time. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing each crease with her thumb. She looked at it for a moment. Then she slid it across the table to Marcus. He picked it up. It was a drawing. Not a child's drawing. A teenager's drawing, precise and detailed and accomplished far beyond what her age suggested, the kind of drawing that comes from someone who has looked at something many times and cared very much about rendering it correctly. It was this house. Drawn from the angle of the driveway, from the perspective of someone standing at the end of the front path and looking at the building straight on. Every detail present. The oak tree to the left. The porch step. The two front windows. And the blue door, shaded with such care that you could almost feel the color of it. He held the drawing with both hands. He looked at the blue door she had drawn. His blue door. The door he had painted on a Saturday afternoon for a woman who said blue gave a house a personality. And then he looked up at the girl at the end of the table, the girl with his hands and her mother's eyes, who had been carrying this drawing in her pocket for long enough that the paper had gone soft at the folds, and he understood. She had been carrying this for him. She had made it and folded it and kept it in her pocket for the possibility of a day that nobody had told her was coming, because something in her had known, or hoped, or simply refused to not be ready. He looked at her and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then she said, in the steady, unbothered voice of a 13-year-old who has already decided what she thinks, "I thought you should have a picture of it. Since you built it and you never got to come back to it." He pressed the drawing flat against his chest with both hands. He looked at her. He said, with a care that came from somewhere much deeper than the words, "Thank you." She nodded once. She picked up her pencil. She went back to her sketchbook. And the room was very quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of something important being fully received, and then Sam asked if anyone wanted more pasta, and the room came back to itself and they all kept going, which was what all of them, in their own ways, had always been best at. David Park came home an hour after Marcus arrived. He set his bag down in the entry hall and walked into the kitchen and looked at the tableau in front of him. His wife standing at the counter with a coffee cup. His children distributed around the table in the ordinary disorder of an after-school afternoon. And a man he had never met sitting at his kitchen table holding a drawing of this house pressed against his chest. David looked at Claire. She looked back at him with eyes that said everything that needed to be said in the 3 seconds before anything was spoken. David set his bag down more carefully this time. He walked to the table. He said, "Marcus." The man at his table looked up at him and said, "David." They looked at each other for a moment, two men standing on either side of the most complicated situation either of them would ever be in, and neither of them flinched from it and neither of them performed anything, and then David extended his hand across the table and Marcus took it and they shook hands with the quiet and complete seriousness of men who have decided, each in their own way, to be better than the situation strictly required. Sam looked between them and said, "Do you guys know each other?" David said, "We are just meeting now." Sam nodded and went back to his apple. And outside the kitchen window, the October light was going the way October light goes, low and amber and long across the ground, and the blue door at the front of the house was still blue, and Margaret and Gerald Reed were sitting in their house in Columbus waiting for a phone call that would tell them that their son had done what they had always known he would do when the time came. Show up. Stand in the place that needed him. And stay. Marcus called his parents from the car at the end of the driveway as the evening light faded. Gerald answered on the second ring. Margaret was already on the other extension. Marcus sat in the driver's seat with the phone in his hand and looked at the house through the windshield for a moment. The blue door. He said, I'm okay. Margaret said, tell me everything. He said, I will. But first I need you to know that Rose is incredible. She is absolutely incredible, Mom. Margaret's end of the line was quiet for a moment. Then Gerald said, we know. And Margaret said, come home when you're ready. The coffee is going to be too strong and I am not apologizing for it. Marcus almost laughed. It was the closest thing to a laugh he had managed in a while. He said, I know. I'll be there Sunday. He started the car. He drove north toward the apartment the doctors had helped him find in a city 40 minutes from Columbus, the one with east-facing windows that got good morning light. Behind him, in the house with the blue door, Sam was finishing his pasta and Maya was already asleep on the couch and Rose was sitting at the kitchen table with her sketchbook open and her pencil moving, drawing something she would not show anyone until it was finished. And in Columbus, in the kitchen where all the important things had always happened, Margaret Reed put the phone down and looked at Gerald across the table. He looked back at her. They had been sitting at that table for 13 years with an absence between them that nothing had been able to fill. And now the absence was not gone, because you do not undo 13 years, you do not simply erase what was lost and what it cost, but the table felt different. The room felt different. Something that had been locked had been unlocked, not restored to what it was but opened into something new, and both of them could feel it sitting there in the kitchen in the quiet of an October evening with the coffee going cold between them. Gerald said, he's all right. Margaret said, yes. She stood up. She walked down the hall. She opened Marcus's bedroom door. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room, the baseball cap on the hook, the track trophy on the shelf, the unnamed smell of the wood and of him. She stood there for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 13 years, she walked in and took the baseball cap off the hook. She held it in both hands. She looked at it. Then she set it on the dresser facing the door, not hanging away from sight but there, visible, present, out where it could be seen when he came on Sunday. She walked back to the kitchen. She sat down. She picked up her coffee cup. And she said, to nobody in particular and to both of them and to the whole of the last 13 years, he's coming home. In the months that followed, the shape of things found itself slowly and without a master plan. Marcus settled into the apartment with the east-facing windows. He called his parents every morning without exception. He got a job doing building maintenance that let him use his hands the way he had always used them, noticing what was broken and fixing it, which was the most himself he had felt in longer than he could fully account for. He and Rose began meeting every 2 or 3 weeks. At the diner. For walks. At a coffee shop near her school where she could show him what she was drawing and he could ask the questions she did not expect him to ask. They did not rush it. They did not try to give it a shape it did not yet have. They just kept showing up, which was all either of them knew how to do and which turned out, as it always does, to be exactly enough. Margaret and Gerald drove to the apartment every Sunday. The same rhythm that had always defined this family, showing up, every week, without being asked, because that was what you did when you loved someone and there was no longer anything standing between you and the doing of it. The first Sunday Margaret arrived, she walked in and looked around carefully at everything and then opened the kitchen cabinet and found the toolbox Gerald had installed the week before and stood there with her hand on it for a moment without saying anything. Then she closed the cabinet and went to make coffee, stronger than necessary, the way she always had, because some things you do not adjust and do not apologize for and that is simply the end of it. One morning about 3 months after Marcus moved in, Gerald arrived on a Sunday to find him out on the landing outside his door, fixing a hinge on the unit across the hall. The neighbor had mentioned it was stiff. Marcus had noticed it was stiff before the neighbor mentioned it. He had gotten his tools without being asked and was on his knees working on it in the Sunday morning quiet. Gerald stood at the top of the stairs and watched his son for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to fit in fine here." Marcus looked up. He almost smiled. "It needed doing," he said. Gerald sat on the top step while Marcus finished the hinge. They talked about Daniel's upcoming visit from Phoenix. About the building. About the weather and the winter and whether the furnace was going to need looking at. The language of men who say the important things sideways, embedded in the ordinary, because that is the language they were built for and it has always been enough. When Marcus was done, they went inside and sat at the table by the east-facing window with the too strong coffee and talked until Margaret arrived with food and the Sunday took on its proper shape. And at some point in the middle of an ordinary sentence about an ordinary thing, Gerald stopped and looked at his son the way you look at something you were certain was gone and cannot quite believe is sitting across from you at a kitchen table on a Sunday morning in Ohio. Marcus noticed. He always noticed. He did not say anything about it. He just let his father look, because 13 years of being lost had made him understand better than most people ever do that the ability to simply sit somewhere and be seen by the people who love you is not nothing. It is, in fact, almost everything. So here is what I want to ask you. And I want you to actually sit with this before you move on, because this story is not a story about extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. Every single person in it was ordinary. They were just ordinary people who did not stop. What would you have done if you were Margaret Reed? A mother who spent 13 years on the edge of a bed in a dark room refusing to say the word dead about her son because presumed was not the same thing and she was not going to give the word more than it had earned. A mother who walked to that driveway every time and held his face every time and then stood there watching the taillights go, not knowing. What would have kept you going on the mornings when keeping going felt like something you had to decide fresh, from the beginning, every single day? And if you were Gerald, who drove instead of flew because a man needs to feel like he is doing something real in a moment where everything is beyond his control, who fixed a back porch step in his dead son's house because it was what his son would have done, who sat near the back of a wedding and kept his face still because other people's happiness was not his to take from them, would you have been able to do any of that? Not the dramatic things. Not the heroic things. The quiet things. The consistent, unglamorous, every week things that nobody applauds and nobody films and that are, in the end, the whole of what love actually looks like when it is being practiced rather than performed. And what about Marcus, standing at that door? He did not know. He had been told that Claire had moved on and remarried, but he did not know about 3 children. And that door opened and showed him 13 years of everything he had missed, standing right there in the frame, and he stepped inside. He did not turn around. He did not stand in the driveway and let the shock of it be more than he could carry. He stepped inside and he sat at the table and he held a 5-year-old's drawing of a house and he accepted a plate of pasta from a 7-year-old who had no idea who he was, and he stayed. That is the whole of the story. That is every version of it. The people who stayed. The mother who stayed on the edge of that bed. The father who stayed with his hands on the wheel. The daughter who stayed ready with a drawing in her pocket. And the son who, after 13 years of being lost, finally came to a door and stayed. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Tell me which person in this story you felt the most. Tell me what you would have done at that door. Tell me whether you would have had Margaret's refusal or Gerald's steadiness or Rose's quiet readiness or Marcus's ability to step inside a life that had kept going without him and sit down at the table and not make the living of it wrong. Because I think you know more about what you would do than you realize. And I think this story might have just told you something about yourself that you did not sit down tonight expecting to learn. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs it today. Someone who is sitting on the edge of a bed in the dark. Someone who is driving instead of flying. Someone who is carrying a drawing in their pocket for a day that has not come yet. Subscribe right now, because every single week we bring you stories that do not just fill the time. They sit with you at the table. They ride home with you in the quiet. They stay. We will see you in the next one.